Hello everyone, it's Albert, and once more I'll be discussing my book series, Is Jesus a Pagan God? And this will be from the first chapter of the first book, which is titled A Quick Survey of Jesus' Copycat Claims, which is going to be just that. It's a quick survey just to let you know what's out there and a quick response, not a detailed one. Those will come in later books, but just a quick response to each, just food for thought, and not a full refutation as that will come later. And in this video, I'm going to be discussing part of chapter 1, which deals with solar, the idea of Jesus as a sun god is solar mythology, so to speak. And there's a few forms of it I will discuss, and the main one is, and the most popular one by far, is what you will find in films like Zeitgeist, which is sometimes titled astrotheology. And it first arose out of various esoteric ideas um, that came about in the Renaissance, but it sort of congealed in various forms. And its first full exposition as a system was in France just prior to the French Revolution by Charles Francois Dupuy in The Origins of All Religious Worship, I believe it was titled. He was the one who he outlined it in a series of lectures. It then later received was made put it was used in a book by Count Volney titled The Ruins, which was sort of his own propagandist theory of history, which included Dupuy's theory, and he did credit Dupuy for it, by the way. That later Dupuy did his full exposition of it in book form, as I mentioned, but Volney probably popularized it more. Dupuy's was far more technical. Volney's was more of a popular exposition, so that it reached a lot, and it was quite discussed a great deal by the intelligentsia in both Europe and America um, in the late 18th century. In in the in the early days of the United States, as a matter of fact, it was pretty much accepted by Thomas Paine, and he has some hints of it in his book Age of Reason, but also in later writings that were published posthumously. He obviously threw his weight behind that, and it was also discussed in letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Um, but it quickly fell out of favor after a few decades because, of course, it would come under criticism, as one might imagine, and there were a number of criticisms of it, but probably the most telling was a satire by Jean-Baptiste-Peres titled Le Grand Erratum, which, using similar reasoning to Dupuy's and Volney's arguments, managed to prove that Napoleon Bonaparte was a solar deity who never really existed. It was obviously done as a satire. And that sort of undermined a lot of the support for it. Now, in subsequent decades, and now it would be centuries, more and more things were found that made it even less tenable, that are more of a technical nature, but basically undermined the entire foundation of the theory, uh, particularly in the last century or so. And that, if for those who may be familiar with it, of course, the idea is that all the gods were metaphors for the sun. Then they'll mention, like in Zeitgeist, they'll mention Horus and Mithra, Horus of Egypt, Mithra of Persia, and that they're all based on the sun's travels through the zodiac, the yearly travels through the zodiac, and other solar events, and they also talk about ages and based on the precession of the equinoxes. They'll talk about the they all will die and then rise 3 days later because the winter solstice at the winter solstice it will hit a low point. The sun will hit a low point in the sky on the 22nd and stay there for about 3 days and then begin rising again. So they'll say that's why he rises on the 25th, etc., etc. Now, there's some flaws in this whole theory. First of all those things about the dying and rising 3 days later for Horus and Mithra really isn't part of their mythology at all. And we'll be dealing with that much more in the future. But just to mention, as I said, I'm outlining the theory. I'm giving a quick outline of criticisms of it. But when it comes to the zodiac, as they found in the last century and a half, when we actually found things like the cuneiform tablets, when they were finally able to decipher the hieroglyphs, which had it occurred in Dupuis' day. It actually occurred in the 19th century, early 19th century. So this was all of these things with Dupuis and Volney all occurred before anyone could actually read the Egyptians' writings. They found a number of things that sort of undermine the idea. First of all, we pretty much know when the whole idea of the zodiac developed. Now, that's not the same thing as astrology in general or the constellations. They would have known of certain. Not every constellation would have been exactly the same, but they knew about Taurus, and they knew that there was these other constellations. They had them mapped and all, but they didn't have the zodiac as a group. They didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the sun's travel across the ecliptic and develop that into its own full system, which we now call the zodiac, until somewhere between 750 and 500 BC. You'll see that in Babylonian texts. Prior to that, the first time you see any real interest in the ecliptic is in the Mulla Pin by the Babylonians, sometime around 1000 BC, where they mention the ecliptic. They mention 17 constellations, and at that point they're more concerned with with the paths that the moon intersects along the ecliptic rather than the sun. Later it gets transferred to a more solar system, and that's when you see eventually the 17 constellations get pared down to 12, and some of them are reconfigured, and you end up with the 12 constellations that we know of as part of the zodiac. Although they didn't necessarily identify all of them with the same animal or the same whatever. For example, Aries the ram, the Babylonians thought of as basically a field hand, an agricultural worker or something. They didn't see him as a ram at all. So you get all of those sorts of things. So the idea that the zodiac would have been the basis for, let's say, the cults of Horus and Mithra, which began millennia before anyone even bothered with the zodiac, is obviously faulty from the very start. Then you get the fact that precession really isn't discovered until about the 2nd century BC, most likely by Hipparchus. You don't really see it mentioned prior to that time. I know there's been people try to argue it, but the evidence is pretty scanty. You just don't. We have lots of writings from Egyptians on the stars. We have lots of writings from the Babylonians, and they don't talk about precession. It just isn't there. And so that obvious argument that they knew about this thing called the Great Year and all that, it's just bogus. That's not really. So the problem there is, of course, this thing isn't this whole elaborate system they outline in a film like Zeitgeist didn't exist for the early Christians to copy. Then there's the matter of the 3 days. And in the past, when I've mentioned this, people really just don't get what I'm saying, and they seem to think that I'm denying the sun does hit that minimum, that solar minimum, which isn't the point I was making. What they don't get is that for the Christians to have fixed the day on the 25th, and then saying all these other ones also used that same date, then that date would have to, that 3-day period would have to have been fixed for centuries and centuries and centuries. For hit it and then begin ascending again on the 25th, and people think that's the case because it happens to be the case now, but it's the case now because we use a much more accurate calendar, the Gregorian calendar, which was introduced in the 16th century, which obviously isn't going to apply to what's going on in the first couple centuries AD, and it didn't. And when they used the Julian calendar, the winter solstice didn't stay in those 3 days. I didn't say again that 3-day period didn't stay there Then there's also the matter that when you hear what they describe in the 3 days, with they're sort of using the sun hitting the minimum and then beginning to rise 3 days later as a metaphor for Jesus dying, staying in the grave 3 days and rising. Problem is that dying and rising thing, the death 3 days, rise again. The Christians don't associate it with that time of year. What they associate with that time of year is the birth of Jesus. Even that came in. I'll describe that. Even that's a weak one. What the dying and rising part, the dying 3 days in the grave and rising again, they associate that with the spring, with Passover. In fact, it's explicitly in. Unlike the birth of Jesus, which really in the New Testament isn't explicitly stated, the time of year for the death and resurrection in the New Testament is explicitly stated. In all four Gospels, it's around the period of Passover. The time of year is explicitly stated, and it is not around the winter solstice. So right away, you've got a complete logical breakdown of the whole thing. But most of all, and here's sort of alluding to what I said to a few minutes earlier, the December 25th date isn't associated with Christianity until centuries after the New Testament is written. See, and this is important, you see, because if you're going to say something was the basis of the New Testament, then it has to be there when the New Testament is written. You can't say December 25th was the basis of the New Testament when it didn't even enter that celebration didn't even enter Christianity until a few centuries later. It just breaks down. Now, you could argue that it demonstrates later syncretism, and I think that you can make a very good argument for that. But to say that's the basis of what the New Testament was written about, when the New Testament was written centuries before anyone ever thought of using that date, you can't make that argument. It just fails. And as much as they try to get around that, you can't. There's nobody talks about December 25th. None of the early Christians talk about December 25th until you start getting in closer to the 4th century. You might get some. There's some references in like the 3rd century, and then at a local level in a few places, and then it becomes more widely accepted in the later parts of the 3rd century. And particularly, it's accepted in Rome, and then eventually it's promulgated in the 4th century in the councils, and then later on it becomes more widely celebrated after that, but it still isn't even universally accepted until a couple centuries after that, and that's only within the Roman Empire. Outside the Roman Empire, some of the other churches still celebrated at other times. So it's kind of hard to say this was the basis of it all, when in fact nobody really used it at the time when the New Testament was written. So you have a bit of a fail there. So that whole theory, as I mentioned, really doesn't cut it at any level, and I will go into much more detail with other things in it. And I know there's other parts of the theory, and I'll go into them that's actually going to be part of a future book titled Jesus in the Sun, which I'm working on at the moment, but that'll come later. Okay, now, there's another theory that some people have brought in, and usually they bring it in without actually understanding it. They bring it in to support thinking that somehow it's the same as the astrotheology theory, and it really isn't. And that's a theory by Max Muller, who was a famous philologist in the late 19th century, who came up with his own idea of the solar myth, that all religion is based upon a solar myth. But his was a philological theory. Basically, he saw religion developing out of what he called a linguistic disease. Now, his theory was that originally, early languages could only speak in concrete terms. So when people dealt with abstract terms, they had to do it metaphorically. That was his theory. That, for example, the more abstract things about the motions of the planets and things like that, they really couldn't grasp these abstract ideas. So they basically put them in terms of some being walking somewhere or something like that. And so when they would describe the sun or some object moving in the sky or doing something in the sky, they would translate it in their language in terms of some being um, just doing like making a like walking or doing something or basically do it metaphorically. Now his idea then was that as languages developed this whole capacity to handle these abstractions more directly, that the meaning of these earlier metaphors were lost. They were the meanings of these earlier metaphors were lost, and consequently, these beliefs became entrenched as talking about these beings who became the gods, and that was his theory. And it was sort of a language evolution thing and a linguistic mistake. Now, um, by the actually by the early 20th century, this whole thing was shot down by the emerging field of anthropology because, well, there was no evidence any of this ever happened. It just didn't make any sense from an anthropological standpoint, and it got shot down by a number of people. But that it quickly fell out of favor shortly, actually, after Muller's death. Actually, Muller had a very high reputation, and then, although a lot of people haven't heard of him, he was considered one of the great figures of um, 19th century as a scholar. He was really a towering figure at the time. Uh, Within half a century, basically all of his theories were pretty much shot down and shredded, and no one really paid any attention to him anymore. But what a lot of people don't realize when they're trying to pull his ideas in terms of explaining Christianity, is that Muller didn't say anything in those terms about Christianity at all. In fact, he would have rejected that because he had part of his theory was that religion, starting from that solar basis, then evolved itself by bringing in things like talking about ancestors and things like that. And then eventually it was moving towards a culmination point of a pure philosophical religion. And his idea was that Christianity was further along that point, so he didn't really associate it as a solar religion at all. But people tend to forget that when they cite Muller. Now, I will mention, by the way, that there was an offshoot of Muller's theory, which was really doesn't have any application to what we're discussing, but I just for completeness sake, that there was an offshoot of Muller's theory, which said that these abstract concepts, rather than making it linguistic, they made it psychosocial or psychological, and it was based on Jungian psychology, where these sort of ideas were coming from the collective unconscious. But as I said, that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with what we're doing, so I'm just mentioning it for completeness sake. Now, the final of these solar myth theories that I'll get into is a theory that became popular in the early 20th century, another sun myth theory, which Jesus is a sun god, which basically said that around the time of Second Temple Judaism, there were a whole bunch of there were cults of Joshua, the Old Testament figure, that Joshua was actually a sun god, and that, well, remember Jesus' name, and Joshua is actually in Hebrew and Aramaic, Yahashua and Yeshua would be the same. It's only when they transliterated them into English that they became separate names, but they actually had in Hebrew and Aramaic, they actually were the same name. So the idea was that that Christianity grew out of was an offshoot of these Joshua cults. Well, the biggest problem with this whole theory is there's no evidence any such Joshua cult ever existed. None. Zip, zilch, nada. And that was pointed out rather quickly, and then everyone went, oh yeah, and then just dropped it. And that was like the last you ever heard of it. It became popular like late 19th century rather, stayed popular for couldn't have been more than a decade or two, and it was completely shot down and forgotten, and that was the end of it. And even I've seen a few people actually bring it up again. You find some websites where somebody discovered a book by John M. Robertson or something on Google Books and say, oh yeah, that sounds great, but it really has nothing to stand on. It has no more evidence for it then than it did now. I mean, now than it did then, and that was actually the last attempt at a scholarly level of the Jesus Sun God idea. Now, that doesn't mean you didn't have it at a less than scholarly, at a more popular level with various occultists and whatever, and more recently with conspiracy theorists. But in terms of a scholarly level, that was the last real attempt at a scholarly attachment of Jesus as a sun god, um, and that's pretty much it. And as I said, none of them really hold much water, and we'll get into much more detail with these in the future. But for now, thank you very much for your time.